Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, talking about the difference between weather and climate. Earlier today I posted a video taken yesterday of my family enjoying the Wyoming mountains, and YouTube and Wikipedia chose to contaminate my video with some propaganda. They said, climate change includes both global warming driven by human-induced emissions of greenhouse gases and the resulting large-scale shifts in weather patterns. NASA explains this on their Climate Kids website. Weather describes the conditions outside right now in a specific place. Climate, on the other hand, is more than just one or two rainy days. Climate describes the weather conditions that are expected in a region at a particular time of year. A region's climate is determined by observing its weather over a period of many years, generally 30 years or more. They also tell us that a week-long heat wave in the Pacific Northwest proves climate change. So sometimes climate is 30 years or more, and other times it's just a few days. Apparently it depends on the propaganda value. Whenever California has a drought, climate experts like Michael Mann of Penn State University tell the press that it was caused by climate change. 5 years ago, the New York Times announced the unending drought in California, and Wired magazine announced that the drought was permanent. But just a few months later, Northern California was having their wettest water year on record, and the ski areas were having a banner year. The Oroville Reservoir was overflowing its spillways, and there was concern by experts that the dam was going to collapse. But now the water level in the Oroville Reservoir is so low, it threatens to shut down a key component of California's useless green energy program, once again demonstrating that green energy is simply not reliable. The Los Angeles Times says that the current drought in California is caused by climate change. But in 1994, they said that drought was the normal climate of California and that the state has suffered century-long droughts in the past. The New York Times said the same thing. Beginning about 1100 years ago, what is now California baked in two droughts, the first lasting 220 years and the second 140 years. 30 years ago, the New York Times reported that huge fires were normal in California and they were associated with La Nina events that often result in droughts. So giant fires in California used to be caused by La Nina. But now the New York Times says that last year's La Nina fires were caused by global warming. I annotated this drought graph from the San Jose Mercury News in order to make this more clear. These 200-year-long droughts in the past were completely natural, but the shorter and less common droughts we have now are definitely caused by humans. This is what climate alarmists call science. I annotated this graph of 2,500 years of New Mexico droughts the same way. New Mexico has had dozens of severe droughts over the last 2,500 years, interspersed with very wet periods. According to climate experts, all of these severe droughts in the past were natural, but the less severe drought they've had recently is man-made. This is the precipitation history for the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico where I grew up. Going back to the year 800, the weather has constantly varied between wet and dry. The Anasazi disappeared after an 80-year-long drought during the 13th century. So extrapolating out Michael Mann's theories, they must have been driving their SUVs too much and not paying their carbon taxes. California has had 200-year-long droughts, but NASA tells children that they can measure climate over a period of 30 years. So according to NASA, the climate of California is drought, and also the climate of California is wet. But the reality is that the climate of California has varied a lot over the last 1,200 years, and you can't characterize the climate based on a 30-year period. It's simply too short. Now let's look at what climate clowns had to say down under. In 2008, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology announced a permanent drought in southeast Australia. And then 2 years later, it rained so much in Australia that it caused the global sea level to drop. Lots of water got transferred from the ocean to the land surface of Australia. This was pretty embarrassing for climate alarmists, so a few years later Michael Mann came to their rescue. It used to be that droughts in Australia were caused by global warming, but now Michael Mann says that both droughts and floods are evidence of global warming. But if we go back 145 years, the Sydney Morning Herald had something completely different to say. They showed that since the 1780s, Australia's weather had alternated between drought and flood. Alternating extreme drought and flood is the normal climate of Australia. Many people like stability and don't like the fact that the weather is constantly changing. 175 years ago, the Aborigines in Australia blamed the change of climate on white men. Climate alarmists are still blaming the imaginary change in climate on white men, so really nothing has changed. 150 years ago, the Brisbane Courier lamented imaginary changes of climate. A plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists and all the philosophic tribe of Laputa in general, to whom the periodical press now affords such fatal facilities. Every season is sure to be extraordinary, almost every month one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Much observation, which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate, seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. So a century and a half ago, the press and climate alarmists were engaged in exactly the same bad behavior they are now. NASA tells children that they can measure climate over a period of 30 years. And people in the 16th century made exactly the same mistake. They said, the weather has changed since I was a child and someone has to be to blame. In the 16th century, climate alarmists blamed witches for cooking the weather. But climate alarmists have become much more sophisticated since the 16th century. They no longer blame witches for bad weather. Now they blame bad weather on Republicans and Donald Trump. I'm going to finish this video up with a look at NASA's Global Climate Change website. The website says, Climate Change, How Do We Know? And they show a graph of varying carbon dioxide levels in Antarctic ice cores over the last 800,000 years. Of course, the graph doesn't actually show anything about climate. All that it's showing is CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. This is a fascinating shell game which they're playing. Now let's look at the ice core graphs which this data came from. This graph shows that over the last 400,000 years, temperature in blue and CO2 in red have varied together. There's been huge swings in temperature between interglacials and ice ages. During the last ice age, much of North America was covered with a mile of ice. What this graph actually shows us is that climate change is natural. Earth swings between hot periods and cold periods, and it has nothing to do with humans. It also shows us something which geologists have known for a very long time. When the oceans warm up, they outgas carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And when the oceans cool down, they absorb CO2. Anyone who's ever opened up a warm beer is familiar with this scientific principle. A warm beer will spew lots of carbon dioxide foam over the side of the bottle and out into the atmosphere. But a cold beer generates much less CO2 foam. Climate alarmists imagine that they're very scientific and they are defending science. But the reality is that they're much closer to 16th century witch burners who are certain that somebody had to be responsible for bad weather. The same bad weather which has been cyclically occurring for hundreds of thousands or millions of years. Toto, Kyrie, and Caesar had a great time playing in the snow yesterday. It's unfortunate that many people living comfortable lives now are incapable of understanding or appreciating just how good they have it. In the past, many people suffered and died as a result of Earth's naturally inhospitable climate. But fossil fuels have made it possible for people to live 24/7 in a climate-controlled indoor environment. If climate alarmists continue shutting down fossil fuels, that will no longer be possible, and many people will suffer and die as a direct result. You can visit Toto, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.